So today we're here to talk about Spring Data REST, data meets Hypermedia, and we've got a lot of fun demos, so you're in for a treat here. First, some quick introductions. My name is Greg Turnquist, and
I'm Roy Clarkson.
And we both work at Pivotal, so you can follow us on Twitter. But I want to start it off and ask a question. Does anybody recognize what website this is? Now, I'll admit that's a shameless plug for a book I wrote last fall that happens to be there. It's a certain website you can maybe buy a couple books.
That's all they do, right?
I hear they do other stuff, but they sell stuff to some developers and stuff. But yeah, this is Amazon. But is something missing from this website? It seems a little bare. Well, what's missing are a whole bunch of links. And how many links were missing on this previous slide if you flip between the two? How about that many links are gone? I went and wrote a little code and yanked out all the links. And instead I thought, is the answer to a page with no links to actually go and navigate to a document that looks like that? Anybody recognize what kind of document that is? Swagger. I went and took all the links and put over 200 links into a Swagger document.
That's definitely how I want to shop on Amazon.
I don't know if my mother could purchase anything at Amazon if she had to use this kind of approach to things. So I got a couple opening quotation marks, or this is one statement by Roy Fielding, the man that wrote the PhD thesis on REST. And he said, "I'm getting frustrated by the number of people that are calling any HTTP-based service or interface a REST API. Today's example is the social site API. It's RPC, it screams RPC. So what needs to be done to make the REST architectural style clear that hypertext is a constraint? If the engine of application state and the API is not driven by hypertext, it cannot be RESTful. It's not a REST API. Is there a broken manual somewhere that needs to be fixed?" I feel like everybody out there is trying to solve this problem of, we need documentation, we need links and stuff, but they're going and using other solutions instead of what was actually written in the dissertation on REST. So we're going to show how Spring Data REST kind of tackles this approach.
So the point is not everything is a REST API.
Yes, not everything fits into that constraint, not everything works that way, but we're going to go explore what Spring Data REST can do with that. And to do that, I'm going to start off with a little quick demo. This is my phone here streamed up on the display here. This is my billion-dollar idea. I'm going to launch this app. It's going to be called Springogram, and I'm going to sell it to some big social network company for maybe $1 billion.
I'll take 5%.
You'll settle for 5. So I'm going to do a Josh Long style. Let's get a picture of the
sideways.
Let me see if it did it earlier. It would actually auto. Okay. All right. Let's take a picture. We'll take that. Let's upload it to my cool. Let's see, did I hit the button right? There we go. Okay. Okay, uploading. Oh. Oh. That's the problem. I need to log back in. Secure site. Okay, let's try that again. All right. Woohoo! Okay. Use the picture. Uploading. All right, there's our awesome picture.
And it's right side up.
And it's right side up. And let's tweet it out there and share it with all our friends online. Okay. Okay, so this is our real cool demo app that's going to make us like tons of money, where you snap pictures and upload them, and it's all built on top of Spring Data REST and other stuff that we're going to dive into here. In fact, it's the various components of Spring are on the page here. You know, at the bottom of everything, we use the awesomely cool Spring framework. We've got some Spring Boot sitting on top of that to make stuff really slick and cool. And if you're getting into Boot, go check out this interesting book called Learning Spring Boot. Okay. On top of that, we have some Spring Data, Spring HATEAOS. Wait, oops, sorry. And we also have some Spring Security, and we even have some cloud stuff here, Spring Cloud and Spring Cloud Services, to make for a cool development experience. So we're going to spend the first part of this discussion going into like what is Spring Data REST, what is Hypermedia, and things like HAL. And then later on we'll show adding on some other critical features in production. What Spring Data REST is, it's a project that leverages Hypermedia and internet standards. It makes it possible for you to go build apps and export your data and do it the right way, the RESTful way the first time. We use a lot of existing standards. We don't go and invent our own format of data. Instead, we're using popularly accepted ones out on there like HAL, which is Hypertext Application Language. ALPS is a form of metadata to describe the services. Another variant of that is called JSON Schema. Those are draft standards right now, but we also use things like URI templates. That's where you can have a path to a resource, but parts of it are parameterized, so you can feed arguments to it. We have a media type called text URI list, where you can feed a list of URIs for a collection. And then we have something called a profile link relation, which is a standard definition of where to go look for metadata. And so the big message in all this stuff is that we're not building our own proprietary format. We're not building something you're going to be locked into. Instead, we're building what the REST community is being very popular and interested in. And later on, we actually have a tool that was built by somebody, the person that built the HAL spec, to talk to HAL services, and it works with our stuff perfectly.
So, Greg, can you tell me what the relationship is between Spring Data REST and Spring HATEAOS? How do those things either work together, or what's the difference? Okay,
well, you know, at the top we're talking about Spring Data REST. Spring Data REST takes several things together. For instance, its job is to go look at any repository-based solution that you're using. Like if you were looking, I believe, at Christoph's presentation on Spring Data Elasticsearch, it has a repository model. There's other things like JPA and stuff. And what Spring Data REST will do is export the data. But what it's doing, it's leveraging the Spring HATEAOS library below it to build links. The Spring HATEAOS library is designed to help you go build links in your applications, and Spring Data REST takes it the extra mile by automatically generating the links that it's going to do for you. And then underneath all that is basically Spring MVC, where we have our built-in native REST support. So at the end of the day, when you build a Spring Data REST app, what you're really doing is you're building a Spring MVC app with Spring Data stored into it.
Which different repositories are supported by Data REST?
Well, for our demo, we're using Spring Data JPA, but we know that it works with MongoDB, Neo4j, Gemfire, Cassandra. Those are the ones I've officially tested. And I know Apache Solr, but anybody that implements the repository model that Ollie was talking about this morning should work with Spring Data REST out of the box. Now I want to talk here about this, a little bit of data and what it looks like in the code. The picture, I just snapped a picture and uploaded it, and what we do is in this app we call it an item. In this case we're talking about a RESTful resource, so this is an item resource record. At the top you see that it has a piece of data called an image, and there it's a URL to the actual image that it's going to render on the page. But then below that, it has a links attribute. And this is the part of Hypermedia that's critical, is that I can look at this particular image, but I also have links to show me related data that's relevant to this record. The first item on the list is a self record. And in REST, a self link is a link to this record. It's kind of like using a this pointer inside your code.
And this is a HAL representation?
Yeah, this is a HAL formatted document. The notation that it's using _links comes right out of the HAL spec. Further down you can see the second item is item, and it tells us that this item in fact does have some options we can feed it. It's a URI template, and you can see the projection bit at the right-hand side, and it tells us it's templated, and that particular format is what a URI template spec looks like. So you can go out and find a library, like a JavaScript library. If it speaks HAL, or it speaks URI template and HAL, then you can do that, and that's what we're actually using as part of the demo.
We're actually going to show how to use that projection a little later in the presentation.
At the bottom, we can see the gallery. That's a relationship, which I'll show you the code for in a moment, and this shows that this particular item, item 32, we can go to items 32 gallery and find the gallery that it's associated with. So you can take a picture and you can put it in a gallery. The record we just saw, here's the code that we have written for it, and it's a class called item. We happen to use some Project Lombok annotations at the top, so I don't have to write any getters or setters, and I've coded it to fine-tune the toString method. But we have a generated ID value, we have a string for the image value, and then we have a many-to-one relationship with a gallery entity. Now at the bottom there's another piece of data that wasn't shown on the previous record, and that's the user data, because in this case we have security plugged in, and when you upload an image, the image gets connected to you, so you own the image. But we put in a JSON ignore directive so that that would not get serialized out by default to the screen. Now, the other side of that, we talked about how in our demo app, we'll relate items to galleries. So you can go put several items into one gallery. And in this case, we have this is the collection of cats. Similar, like before, it has the data at the top. In this case, it just has one field description, cats. And then below, we have the HAL links listed, including its self link. In this case, the gallery link looks the same because there's no template art options in this situation. And at the bottom, you can start with the gallery and say, show me the items related to this gallery. And so if you look at the corresponding class, you can see a similar structure here. We have an ID field that's managed by the persistence container. We have a string value for the description, and then we have a one-to-many relationship with items. So you can have one gallery can contain many items, one item can belong to one and only one gallery, or 0 or 1 gallery, I should say. So what I'm going to do here is look at Live System. I have a copy of the demo app here. Let me zoom it up here. That's not what I meant. So if I log into my billion-dollar idea, let me go upload a little image here. Okay, if I go visit this particular image that I uploaded, I can click on my demo app and see a HAL record. Let me zoom it up here and make it a little more readable. So this looks similar to the static data. This is all linked stuff, and the browser can read most of this. If I click on that, it can give me the raw image data. If I click on this thing, if I click on this, it just keeps taking me back to this. Now here's the fun thing. Browsers don't speak URI template, so if I try to click on that, it's not going to handle it correctly. And I'm going to let Roy talk about that later. But one thing before I'm going to do one thing. I'm going to take my little picture and I'm going to put it into this collection. Okay, so now in my collection of cats, I have my nice little Bazinga t-shirt shot that I uploaded. If we can go to that HAL record and I go to and I navigate the gallery relationship, it should show me, it should take me to the collection of cats. And in this case, I can see, the gallery itself, or I can navigate in the other direction. It can give me now here, this is a collection of all the items that are in this gallery. And in this case, this is all a HAL formatted document. In this case, you see the embedded tag or the embedded type because it contains a collection of data in it.
Are you using a plugin to display this data?
Yes. In this case, I'm using the JSON View plugin, which I've seen it work on Chrome and Firefox. I'm unsure about Safari, Safari has this nasty side effect that if you click on certain HAL documents, it just downloads it as a text file into your file system, so I don't use Safari for demos. But I can click that button and look at the raw document that it sent me, and this one looks nice and prettified. Other systems may look at may be compressed JSON. So, you know, the idea is I can kind of navigate around, and I want to go look at this stuff in its raw form because everybody understands what JSON is. Let's kind of get the concept down about we have both data and we have relationships via links, and that's what the critical stuff of Hypermedia is. You know, if you add more fields, Spring Data REST is automatically putting them in there. I didn't have to write any Spring MVC controllers to go take that data that was loaded in the database and export it out to here. I didn't have to write any view resolvers or anything like that.
Spring Data REST just takes everything that's in your repository and exposes it as Hypermedia.
Yes, it takes every repository that it can find and will export it for better, for worse. Which leads us to a issue because part of this thing is to talk about security, which we're going to get to. But first, before we go in that direction, I want to show you what does it take to actually turn on Spring's Data REST. You just need these two dependencies, Spring Boot Starter Data REST and Spring Boot Starter Data JPA. If you're not caught up on Spring Boot comes with a lot of starter POMs. And this is to pull in items that you need. And one thing you'll notice here is there's no version numbers. Because when you use Spring Boot, the version numbers are pre-picked for you, so you don't have to manage that. And for the starters, usually come with multiple dependencies. And then, in this case, I said we're using Data JPA, but I could have pulled that out and swapped it out for Spring Boot Starter Data Mongo. Or used another dependency for that. On the other side of that is if you want to write some Java code that's going to talk to one of these services, in other words, what we talked about was for building like a server. If you want to do a Java client to talk to one of these HAL-based services, you want the Spring HATEAOS project. You don't have to have Spring Data REST to talk to one. And in this case, you would want the Spring Boot Starter HATEAOS dependency, excuse me.
So that raises a question. You are using Spring Boot for the application, and you've given Spring Boot dependencies, but are there project dependencies that are not Spring Boot? Like if somebody would want to use Spring Boot or not want to use Spring Boot? I can't imagine that.
Yeah, there's different ways to pick it. You can go to the project page to actually look up what version. Like if you go, like what I'm going to do is let me go back to my IDE and let me go to this one. And because that's absolutely unreadable in that format, let's zoom it up here a little. So here at the top, I have Spring Boot Starter Data JPA and Spring Boot Starter Data REST. What this is doing for me is, that is not the right key. If I open up and look in that POM file, this is Spring Boot Starter Data REST, and scroll down here, it is pulling in Spring Boot Starter Web, Jackson Annotations, Jackson Data Bind, Spring Core, Spring TX, and Spring Data REST Web MVC. And essentially, if you go pull in those, you can pull in those dependencies yourself if you're not using Boot. And some of these are other Boot starters, so you can navigate down that trail and pull in all the parts. But part of what this shows is that Spring Data REST is very, very high on the application development. Instead of being a low-level framework or low-level core component, it's relatively high-level and pulling in lots of components to build a fully functional web app. That is not what I meant to hit. Okay. The data JPA one, which is what I was trying to jump to. The data JPA one, it pulls in some boot starter stuff, and you can look down in here where it has things like JDBC and etc. But this is the magic of if you're not using Spring Boot, then you should be. So if you go do that, a lot of the stuff is covered, and as you upgrade your version of Boot, it'll upgrade to the latest stable release, or if you're using an M1 release, you keep up with what the releases are, and that's a big problem you don't have to deal with.
Yeah, Dave kept using the phrase "it's magic" last night in the keynote, and it's not magic, but there is some complicated stuff that's going on. And I was looking through the Spring HATEAOS auto configuration in Spring Boot earlier today, and it's a couple pages long of conditionals and things that Spring Boot is handling for you and wiring up for you that you would have to do on your own if you weren't using Spring Boot. And the same thing goes with the rest of the Spring Data projects as well.
Our next slide said a little part of demo is I was showing you sort of the raw format of the JSON going through the browser, and at the beginning I mentioned that the spec lead for the HAL spec, Mike Kelly, actually went and built a Backbone.js app, a purely front-end app to talk to HAL services, and we actually called the HAL Browser. I'm going to zoom it back a little so we can see everything. What this is doing is this is going out and interrogating the same set of data and coming back with stuff. And on the left-hand side, you can specify your starting point. So it's pointing to our root location where our HAL data is coming from. Down here, it shows me some links that it has. There's a galleries link, there's an items link, and then there's a profile link that I was mentioning earlier with some data. And over here, I can see the outputs here. Down at the bottom, we have this another HAL document. This is at the root of your Spring Data REST service. It will show you a link for each of the exported repositories. And in this case, we have an item repository and we have a gallery repository. Now, earlier I was having to navigate. Question?
So if I had multiple microservices, one for galleries, one for items, coming from different places, would you write the repository to that, get it to the local link? Because behind your API, they could have different URLs. Under the gateway, you want them to all use the same API.
Yeah, this can absolutely work in a microservice configuration. And what maybe some of you have spotted, and we're going to talk about in more detail later on, is this app has been split up into multiple microservices. In this case, we're talking to one of the microservices at this point in time, looking at this HAL data. And Roy will be able to talk about that a little bit more. But what I wanted to stress here is earlier I was clicking on certain links and it was iffy, some links the browser knew how to talk to, some the browser did not. This browser does know how to talk to all those links. Like if I go to this, if I click on this thing for to go view all items, it shows me that I have several options to pick from and I can actually go type the values in if I want to substitute any of those arguments, but I'm going to say, no, I'm going to leave them empty. Just go ahead and navigate to that. So now if you look at the top here, you can see that I've navigated to /API items. You may notice that the port number is different than what I started with at the top. That's because I went in through a front end and it routed me to where the actual HAL data is being served from. And that's where we're going to talk more about the microservice stuff later. In this case, it pointed out we actually got a page of data, but the collection that we saw on amongst the items is actually being represented down below in this embedded resources. And I can just see that I have one item total, which is my Bazinga shot. And if I expand this, I can see that one piece of image data. Now earlier on the raw data, we saw images and we saw the links side by side, but what they do in the HAL browser is they show you the data at the top and then they put the links in this separate box to navigate by it. And this is actually possible where I can, I can go in here and actually do post or put operations through this thing and make RESTful calls to alter stuff. But like if I'm looking at this, right now I'm looking at, this is item 0, it's my Bazinga shot. I can see the gallery relationship at the bottom and I can say, click on that, take me to the gallery, and it takes me to the collection of cats again. And it gives me, here's the links for that thing, and I can go to the self link, and it does this. The important thing to remember about a self link is a second ago it read gallery. If I back it up here, It said item/1/gallery. That denotes a relationship. It says in the context of items 1, what it's related gallery. But if you click on a self link, it says now drop all that context and just give me the canonical reference to that gallery. And this is gallery 1. And so over here on the right, I can see the links. I can navigate on the links here, and I can also look at what response body was sent back through the thing. So I mean, you can take this app and point it at any HAL service, and that's what we did. The only edit I made, I actually submitted a contribution to this project, was to take advantage of our JSON schema data when creating new entities.
I have a question.
The HAL gives you the link under self, but it doesn't tell you what verbs you're looking for that link. You have no idea if you can delete it, update it.
That is correct. The question or comment is that you can get the link, but it didn't show anything about the verbs you can exercise. That's halfway correct in the sense that there's actually another button over here. They call it non-get, and what this is they've made this real generic pop-up box here where you can type in all the stuff, but actually right here they actually default to post, but you could do that. So you can type it in. They don't have it as a drop-down. It's not actually using any of Spring Data REST metadata to say, what do you support? Like it's not doing an options query to say, what options do you have?
So that was your question, is it wasn't actually showing the verbs on the screen. Yeah.
Really, the HAL Browser is more the responsive my back and then all options on every link to really know what to do.
Yeah, I look at this tool. This is a real handy tool. There's a lot of rooms to improve it on, but to me it's kind of fascinating that you can pick this tool up that was developed by somebody else independently, and because we both are using the same format of data according to the spec, it plugs in. It's interoperable.
In the case of JPA, you have in your example a one-to-one and a main-to-one relationship, and these are translated into links.
Yes.
You have a new annotation called name entity graph and add entity graph. Would that change the way that the JSON is returned, like taking advantage that those have been already eagerly loaded and not with links but embed the data?
Okay, the question is we're currently demonstrating JPA, and we're using one-to-many and many-to-one annotations, and in Neo4j they have new things like, was it named entity graph was the name of it, or named graph?
Yes, name entity graph or entity graph.
Okay, this is where I'm going to immediately say I'm actually not very proficient with Neo4j, so I don't know the answer to that.
It's JPA, it's
Huh?
not Neo4j. It's JPA.
Oh, it's JPA?
JPA. These are annotations for eagerly loading.
Oh, my mistake. I don't know what it does in that situation, but that's a very good question because I would like to know the answer to that. Ollie may know the answer to that one, but he's not here with us today. But we can go try to look that up. Okay. So if you want that thing, this is all you need to do to add to your application is to put this in there. It's a project that's out on GitHub. They don't even release it to Node necessarily, but there's a WebJar for it. We've grabbed the WebJar, we've wrapped it up with some nice Spring MVC magic, and it's there with one added dependency.
So that's dropping it into a Spring Data REST project.
Yeah, that's to put this in. Yeah, if you want to use that, you want to go put that into where you have your Spring Data REST stuff, because then it will have that available to look at its adjacent Spring Data REST service that's right there. And you go to it, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
And you navigate it to it at /browser in your app. In this case, I've configured the app to be serving the data up at /API. So in this case, you find it at /API/browser.
Before we go ahead, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about consuming this on the client. So we talked about the Spring HATEAOS project, but maybe you could show how you've consumed it in the client code on the web page.
Okay. All right. Let's see here. I'm going to move this to presentation. So I have written the front end using React.js, and if you go check spring.io/blog today, I actually have part 2 of a 5-part blog series that I'm writing called React.js and Spring Data REST. I wrote a little bit of code, and I happen to be using a library called Cujo.js, and they have a library in this toolkit called REST.js that has HAL support and URI template support and some other good stuff. But essentially I have an idea where you start at a root document and you navigate through a set of relationships. In this case, I start at the root, and then I go look for a particular relationship name that's in that HAL document inside the links called items. So it goes and finds the items HAL document, it returns it back, and then in this case we have a custom finder method, and in Spring Data REST it will serve up all the finders underneath a sub-relationship called search, and in there this is a case to look for all items that are not assigned to a gallery or where the gallery entry is null. But you can also go use something else like maybe RESTangular or something that people are using in AngularJS. I helped somebody who had built an Angular tutorial, and they'd written a whole lot of boilerplate code, and I said, did you know you could rip out 3/4 of your Java code and put it in Spring Data REST and your whole app will still work? In that case, they had handwritten all the verbs in versus some of these libraries that can actually speak HAL. But in this case, you can see the the embedded thing like we showed in that JSON document, etc. But the Spring HATEAOS project itself also has a module if you're writing Java code to talk to it, and they have what I would go and find in the documentation is called the Traverson library. It was inspired by a JavaScript project with the same name, and it essentially does what this thing is doing, where you can navigate a certain trail of relationships, and at the end, then you're like, now let me do something with that data result set, whether it's a single resource or a collection resource.
So is the general idea that you would know within your client application sort of the root URL, and then you would be able to traverse the entire data graph without having to hard code other URLs to other things?
Yeah, that's exactly the idea, is that we should be navigating by relationships, and this is what Roy Fielding meant when he said we need to be using hypermedia to drive what we're doing. And in a sense, it's almost like through the HAL browser, I could navigate it because I could see what the things are that it was being shown to me. Because as the user of it, I had to understand it, and to a degree, the idea of hard coding URIs into the apps makes your app very brittle. So when URIs change or there's adjustments made, and if the relationship could be the same, but if it's going to break your code because your URIs are different and you didn't update your Swagger document or something, then that's very unfortunate. But in this sense, we only have one root document, and that makes it very easy to navigate this stuff. That's a good question. The question is there a way to go ask, hey, Spring Data REST, what verbs do you support? Is that? Yeah, so if I'm navigating to this URI, what do you support? Do you support get? Do you support post? What do you support? Spring Data REST supports the HTTP verb options, which is designed to do that. You're supposed to be able to use options against a URI, and it's supposed to give you back a particular header that lists all the verbs that are available. Right now, by default, Spring Framework's dispatcher servlet will not actually answer an options request. Instead, it routes it directly to the container. So if you stand up a Spring Data REST service and you actually query if you do an options query, it's going to go straight to the embedded Tomcat server and say, what do you support? And Tomcat says we support everything. So it may not be accurate. There's actually a configuration setting. If you go wire a dispatcher servlet in a Spring Boot app, there's a configure override where you can say, I want the application to answer option requests. Then it will delegate it to the app, and then Spring Data REST will answer what it can support or not support in that context. There's talk about Well, what if you wanted to answer it for some things but not for others, and the dispatcher servlet currently doesn't handle that situation? It's kind of an all or nothing proposition, and they don't turn it on by default because it's viewed right now as a potential security issue to give away that much information. So we're talking about we're trying to design and figure out how to deal with that situation to have it on a more controlled, fine-grained basis.
So if you're using the HAL browser to find your gallery item link, and you say you're going to do a post, you need bytes for the image.
Well, yeah. So the question is about what about content type, or like when you're doing like posting an image, and part of this stuff I had to do some homework to figure out how the heck do you post an image over a URI. So this case I had to look up, I think it was some JavaScript specific stuff. I can't remember the details, but I had to look up what was the size of the image on there to do an upload, which I got it in the upload controller. So part of this is there's a form, there's a particular form to get a form entry you put on the page. You have to collect the data off. This is getting into some JavaScript weed details about how to go actually upload files, and this is sort of. Am I missing the point, or?
Yeah, that wasn't the question. I know how to do that.
Okay.
The point, I guess, was when you get the HAL data back, that it's going to show you document your API. It doesn't tell you verbs, but it also doesn't tell you content type. So, if you have gallery item, you have that link, you need to know to do a post of content type image.
Well,
If you don't know that, you can't use the API.
I think what it does here, the content types, it comes back with JSON, and I think it defaults here to using, when you're going to upload, to use content type application JSON. I don't know if I'm getting your point.
So if you go to the link to post a brand new image, you can't type application. So, if you didn't know anything about this API, how would you discover that?
Well, what's not indicated in here is what this is storing is a string, and the string in this case is an href to where the image is. And so to do that, I'd have to go in and put in some message details. Let me go back to the root. Go to entry point. Go.
So your concern is that it's just not giving you enough information back for a client app to not have some domain knowledge about how to use that URL. Yeah.
Well, here's part of the metadata that I pulled up, and in this case I have a slightly out of date message here where it says this is a base64 encoded version of the image. I need to update that message so it actually reports this is the URL location of where the image is hosted at. So to actually upload an image, it's a two-step process. You first need to upload the image to your file store, and then you need to get the location of that, and then go create an entry in the items table with the URL to the image. Why don't we change gears here and do some security stuff?
Okay, Greg asked me to work on this app with him, and one of the things that we wanted to include was security, and partly because he made a comment that it's not real until it's secured, and we said, okay, cool, we'll add some security. Rob Winch, who's the Spring security lead, said do not implement security on your own, so we naturally said we're not going to do it on our own. So we turned to Spring Security and looked to see what it could offer in terms of securing a Spring Data REST application. And Spring Security is a comprehensive and extensible support for both authentication and authorization. And authentication is your credentials, whether that's username, password, two-factor auth, or biometrics, something like that. Authorization is what you're allowed to do. So as a user, am I allowed to post a picture? Am I allowed to view a gallery? These are the kind of things that authorization support within Spring Security allows you to configure within your app. Some of the common attack vectors that Spring Security will handle for you are session fixation. In this case, if an app is not designed particularly well and you had a user ID within the URL, for example, a malicious person could view that and potentially take that ID and then log in, use it to log in as somebody else, and then interact with their account details. Spring Security handles that out of the box. Cross-site scripting. This is a pretty common attack vector, and it's where JavaScript is trying to load something from a different site and that way inject code into your application, malicious code that's able to potentially access sensitive data or get your user to enter sensitive data that can be captured. Cross-site request forgery, also very similar, getting user to enter sensitive data that can be intercepted. And then user interface redress attacks. What these are is using some malicious code on the client side to put something like a button on top of your user interface and, again, capture user information somehow instead of entering it into the website as it was meant to be. And the good thing is Spring Security just handles all these things. So as a developer, you can include Spring Security in your application, and you don't have to generally worry about these things. Obviously, you talk to any security engineer, and they're constantly worried about everything. So it's not going to be out of their mind. But as a developer, we can be a little assured that there's a large community working on this project and that they're thinking about all of these different security vectors, attack vectors. So one of the things we wanted to do was to figure out how to secure the image data within the Spring Data REST application in Springogram. So if we look up at the very top, we've got a pre-authorized annotation, and it's looking for a role of role user. And Greg and I both have this role user for our accounts in the Springogram application. So that means if you're logged in, you have a role user, then you can interact with the item repository. And if you see the save and delete functions down here, there's two more pre-authorized with some longer expressions in here to determine whether the user is null or not null, and whether the user has an authenticated name. And if you don't have any of those, then it's not going to let you save or delete an image. And it's really just that simple in terms of Spring Security adding protection on your methods and classes. Anything to add on that?
Well, the one nice thing about it is this is all an interface definition. I don't have to go write a concrete implementation of this code. I can just declaratively put my security policy and the finders and stuff that I need here, and Spring Data will go generate it for me, and the code that you don't write has no bugs.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we're adding this straight onto Spring Data repository declarations, it's not extra code that we have to write.
Say that again?
The role user? Yeah, I'll show you in the code in just a minute. So we've also got a user table that's in the application, and because Greg mentioned before, Spring Data REST is just going to kind of expose everything, and he said for better or worse, and in this case, this is kind of a worse. You really don't want it to just arbitrarily display or allow access to everything within the user table. So in this case, we've got, this is not a Spring Security annotation, but this is a Spring Data annotation. Repository REST resource exported equals false. So in this case, it's going to not export the user information and in a way secure it. So Spring Security can do a lot of things, but you still as an application developer have to determine and figure out how you're going to represent your data and be cognizant of things, you know, and how the data is going to be returned to the user and what's accessible, and make sure that things like user information and sensitive data are not being accidentally exposed. So projections are also not a Spring Security concern, but this is something that's relatively new within Spring Data. And we talked about that before. We've got this template projection down here on the third row or whatever, this item. And something that allows you to do is to add some data to something, to a record that's not, or a resource that's not necessarily part of that resource. So it allows you to kind of compile or combine some things together. And in this case, we wanted to expose the user, or excuse me, the owner within the item resource. So we created an owner projection. And again, it's an interface, so it's not code that we've written. And this is something that Spring Data provides for you. You name the projection, and then you tell it the data that you want to be returning when it's queried. So let's go take a look at that security configuration.
So the question is the projection applied to the JSON data that's being rendered? Spring Data REST is leveraging Jackson to do JSON serialization, and essentially we use the projection to change the getters that Jackson's going to apply when serializing the data out to JSON. Yeah, he's going to fish it up here, but essentially when you say, render me an item, an item element and apply this, it says don't use items getters to decide what to serialize. Instead, use what's in the projection code. And it can actually add data, if you add fields like get user, which he's put in here, or you can create projections that remove data. And these getters in the projection definition also support at value spell expressions. So you can actually create virtual attributes that would pull in different things, like you could grab first name and last name and put them together and make a virtual field like that. And what goes along with all that is projections are in general a read-only concept. So you don't think about posting through projections or putting through projections to do updates. That's a good question. I don't know that one, if you can apply security to a projection or not. That would be interesting.
So this is where I'm going to recommend that you go to Rob Winch's Spring Security talk on RESTful APIs. It's tomorrow morning. I've got the time and room at a later slide, but he's going to spend the whole presentation talking about how to secure a RESTful API. Yep.
Let's say there's a scenario where there's an object, probably let's say it contains n fields, out of which one role, 7 users with a particular role would be able to edit
Okay, so the question is, if you had defined some kind of entity and it has perhaps like 10 attributes, are you able to define projections where one role maybe has access to these 7 and this other role has access to these 5 sets? Is that possible? And what I'm thinking is it may be a little convoluted, but it may be possible because I'm trying to think if you can create a parent class and have subclasses that you have repositories against, because then you could have different pre-authorizations on them, and you can definitely put pre-authorization headers on custom finders. It may be you would have to go to the @query option. There's an annotation you can put on finder methods in any Spring Data project to write the query yourself. So I'm not sure this tactic is the way to go, but you could probably write 2 different finders, and you could put an @pre-authorize on them, and you may have to write the @query DSL logic there, so you could have 2 different finders. And if you code that up, Spring Data REST will handle that. Yeah, it's, yeah, that one's a little more complicated. I'm not sure about doing that query stuff on writing operations. So that one I'm not sure about how to handle. So I'm trying to think about how you wire the stuff in, like Sam said about using ACLs. So if you can put it at the domain level, you can. I don't know how it's going to react if you try to push something that you're not supposed to. It may, if it violates the ACL, I guess it could ripple back an error and not let you do that. So it sounds like a neat example to work on. What are you showing us?
Yeah, so somebody was asking about the.
You want to go to view presentation mode?
So here's the configuration that we have for enabling Spring Security. We've got an annotation on a web security configuration adapter class. It's enable web security. And then we've got enable global method security with pre-post enabled equal true. And this pre-post enabled equal true allows us to use those annotations for pre-authorization. And there's actually a corresponding one for post-authorization, which has its uses, but you probably don't, generally speaking, you'd probably want to use the pre-authorization because you want to make sure that the person has rights and access to do the things that you're restricting. And let's see. So we're configuring a user details service, and we're using a password encoder. And again, Rob's going to go into a lot more of these details. He's got 2 sessions. One of them is right after this one, and then there's another one tomorrow morning. In this case, this is where you're configuring the HTTP security. We are allowing all of the static resources permit all, meaning all of the JavaScript and CSS, in this case, all of the Bower components, everything that's in that folder. Spring Security is basically going to let anybody query those or retrieve those via HTTP. There's no security on that. And then any other request, it has to be authenticated. And we're using form login, so form security. And login page is also permit all, meaning that you don't have to be logged in to view the login page, which is nice. And then we've got a logout URL, that's where you specify that. And let's see, down here we've got some different profiles available within the application. And we've named them Basic and SSL. And these are doing some checks to see if either of those profiles are enabled. And then in that case, we would enable HTTP Basic, or we would enable the SSL support within Spring Security. So if we go to look at security details loader, This was another question, is where that role user is coming from. So right now
Zoom it
we're...
up. Zoom it up again.
Yes, sorry. Presentation mode. So in this case, we've, through code, we're wiring up a couple users, Greg and myself. Greg's got role user, and so do I.
This is not how to stand up production data.
No. This is how you do a demo application. But the question was, where does that role user come from? And this is where it's coming from. So we're creating a user object and setting the roles on that. Okay. Let's see. So conveniently, just like with Spring Data, it's very easy to get Spring Security within your application. You add the Spring Boot Starter Security, and that's going to include all the dependencies that you need. And then via those few annotations that we showed you on the configuration method, we'll get you started. And let's talk about a note on HTTPS. You need to use it in a production application. There's really no excuses. You can add Spring Security and secure this application as tightly as you want, but if your traffic is unencrypted, then you might as well be attaching a safe to a piece of fiberboard, which is just like what's in my hotel room. Seems very secure. So, but yeah, seriously, HTTPS it needs to be everywhere. Even the most benign application, you really need to consider doing HTTPS because of all of those cross-site forgery, cross-site attacks. People can do malicious things with any website that's not secured, and HTTPS is really one of the frontline defenses on that.
I think the word I heard was, it's 2015, it's time to encrypt everything. And we do take the excuse, this is just a demo, so we're not running this over SSL.
One other thing I did want to show you, and this has been in a few blog posts on Spring AO blog. Is within Spring Boot, this is how you can enable SSL support with Tomcat.
I do want to hedge something here. In Spring Boot, there's actually a single flag setting to actually flip on SSL support if you want to use it. You have to supply it with a key file, the properly set up key file to do that, and it's got like a default name for it and all. What that configuration does is it turns on SSL for port 443. It does not turn on any form of redirect from port 80. What I have here is this is actually how to configure it if you wanted both port 80 and 443, and if you want port 80 to automatically redirect you to port 443 using Spring Security settings. Any security professional will tell you that is still subject to a man-in-the-middle of attack. I say the window's a little narrower, and you have to go evaluate if that's the right solution for your shop, or if you can just tell all your clients to go HTTPS and say, I don't know, put a static page if they go to port 80 and say, we don't do this way, and tell people to go start correctly. So.
Yeah, and actually I talked to Rob a couple times before this talk, and he's showing and going to be demonstrating several ways of doing some of these attacks and how Spring Security can protect you against those.
Question?
But you don't need to have a once you turn SSL, it's not going to expose HTTP.
Well, if you turn on this profile, it does expose both of them. It exposes both HTTP and HTTPS. So this would handle the redirects. What kind of was not mentioned is one of the default settings that Spring Security turns on is HSTS, which directs your browser that once you go to an SSL site, it tells your browser the next time automatically prefix it with HTTPS and start on a secure port. And you actually have to go figure out how to clear that out of the browser's database. So if you go here one time and it redirects you from port 80 to 443, the next time you go visit it, If you just type the domain name and not the prefix, it will start at HTTPS. So it's like, again, like I say, there's this like tiny window where somebody could stage a man-in-the-middle attack, and also I wrote this before they added that feature in the first place and had it in my book. So.
Okay, so we're going to move on and talk about latest and greatest buzzword, microservices, unless there's any other questions. All right, so what are microservices? If you look at Martin Fowler's article on microservices, he says microservice architecture style is an approach to developing a single application as a suite of small services, each running in its own process and communicating with lightweight mechanisms, often an HTTP resource API. And that's a very good article. I recommend looking at that if you're considering utilizing microservice architecture. Microservice, to me, has always felt like maybe not the right way to describe this. It's really decomposing a single application into multiple applications, and you're not reducing complexity. You're obviously adding more complexity to your application. So, you know, we talk about that sometimes as a holy grail, but it really just depends on your application needs as well. And one of the things that we wanted to do was with Springogram. Greg had originally built it as a single application, and we demoed this application last year. And this year we said, hey, we're talking about cloud native everywhere. You can't miss it. So let's break up Springogram and see what we can do with this. Because this is going to be the similar challenge that a lot of you are probably going to face with applications. You've got existing applications. How do you start? Where do you identify things that you can move to a new service or new application? And so we went down this path and tried to do this with Springogram as well. One of the things, another sort of buzzword, 12-factor apps. We throw this around a whole lot. These are the actual 12 factors. I don't know that, I see people talking or mentioning 12 factors all the time, but I'm not going to go through all of these. Currently, Springogram, we don't do all of this stuff, but we've started trying to do a lot of them. And because we've adhered to a lot of these principles, we've actually been able to break up the Springogram application and ultimately deploy it to Cloud Foundry, and it turned out not to be too complicated or too painful. All of those are at that 12factor.net website as well, more information. Of course, you can Google all of this and find plenty more information. And not to forget, Matt Stein, who's our resident microservice cloud native expert, has written a book, and I believe we have some of them at the Pivotal table out there.
I think there's is it a book signing tomorrow at 4:30? Was that what I heard? You can go get your copy signed by the man himself.
So let's talk about Spring Cloud. And if you guys were in the keynote last night, they talked about some of this stuff. We're going to talk about how we utilized it within Springogram. These are four of the things the four of the features that we tried to incorporate. One, intelligent proxy, service discovery. Intelligent proxy is using the Netflix OSS Zool library. Service discovery is using the Netflix Eureka library. Circuit breaker is also using Netflix. And then we're using external configuration, which is part of Spring Cloud itself. So here's what the application looks like now that we've broken it up. And I realize now I should have put a prior slide up here, but I don't have that for you. Everything used to be in one Springogram application, and it was hitting one SQL database. And now we've broken it up into a backend application, and we have a MongoDB file service, and each of these is hitting its own independent data store. So to include Spring Cloud within your project, you need to replace the Spring Boot parent with the Spring Cloud parent. Another method to do this is to declare it as a BOM separately, but I tend to find it easier just simply replace the Spring Boot parent. The Spring Cloud parent is additive, so everything within boot is going to be available if you use Spring Cloud parent. The current release is Angel SR3, and Brixton is in progress right now. A number of the dependencies are right here. These are the ones that we're taking advantage of within this application: the Zool, Eureka, Hystrix, and the config client. So let's look at the code and see how we've wired all this up.
You can see the run box, command 4. You need all the tabs that it's running. Or you're going to the Zool stuff.
Yeah.
Okay.
So our Spring Boot application is right here, and we've got 3 new annotations that we've added to it. One is enable discovery.
View presentation.
Yes. One day I'm going to learn to go into view presentation mode. And we've got enable discovery client, which is going to turn on Eureka, enable Zool proxy, and enable circuit breaker, which is going to enable the Hystrix support. And it's really kind of that easy. We can show you. I don't know how to do this in presentation mode, Greg.
I don't know if that will go to presentation mode. If I had Josh Long, he knows how to jump font sizes, but this shows all 4 of our processes. Roy's diagram showed 3, but we have to run 1 extra process, our Eureka server that they mentioned Eureka last night at the keynote. So that's why we have 4. And Roy did was he killed the front end part. We have the front end where the UI is, and then the back end service is where the Spring Data REST parts are. So he killed the front end, and now we're looking at Eureka, and it may be a little hard to read, but it says not found Springogram front end by logical name.
Yeah, so using Eureka, we're able to do service discovery. We're able to talk to the different services, and there's no hard-coded URLs within any of these services. So when you enable that service discovery using that annotation, it's going to go register itself with Eureka. If Eureka is not in a known location, then you do have to configure that location. It has to know where Eureka is. And it's going to register itself with a name that you've defined within the configuration. In this case, it's Springogram that you see down here, Springogram front end. And then Eureka is going to keep a registry of all of these services. And anytime one of the services wants to talk to the other one, it asks Eureka, how do I find it? And it tells it.
Roy, can we really trust Eureka? I mean, it's just a piece of software. I mean, how dependable is Eureka?
Well, as I mentioned, Eureka was an OSS project from Netflix, and if any of you guys are familiar with Netflix, they've run at pretty high scale, and so this is something that they use. And I expect that it's more scale, more traffic than the rest of our websites are running. So if we start up the front-end application again, what we can see is I'll switch it back over to Eureka.
Now, when it went down, you may not have been able to see it was very quick at detecting that there was no heartbeat anymore and dropping it. Here, it's taking a little longer to get back up.
Well, you can see, so the front-end application, you can see Discovery Client, Springogram front end right there. So it's now registered with Eureka. And you look over on the Eureka log. You can see that it's registered a new instance of Springogram front end. So that service is successfully registered with Eureka, and everything is happy there. Let's take a look at how we're using Hystrix. So actually, let's flip over to the demo. Close that guy. We're still running. Okay, we're running. If we come over to, again, IntelliJ, and we shut down the backend service.
So the back end is where our Spring Data REST component is, and it's where we get that HAL record that says, here's the items, here's the URL link to where the image is located. So it's telling us where in the system that's located. So
yeah, that's right. So if that goes down, we don't want the whole front end UI to just suddenly look like it exploded and blow up. So we want to see something that still resembles the correct UI. In this case, what's going on is the circuit breaker kicked in, and we're getting a default image now, which is the Spring logo. So instead of seeing the Bazinga t-shirt, we're seeing this Spring logo. And let's see. I'll show you how this is running on Spring Cloud Foundry in just a minute, and I can show you the Hystrix dashboard running there. I actually don't have it running locally right now. If we go back, and we restart that back end, it's going to re-register with your Eureka, and the front end will once again know how to communicate with it. While it's doing that, we can look at this this image, image via link. I tried it, and Greg doesn't have it turned on. Because I have that enabled on mine, and it's the perils of using somebody else's laptop. So this image via link, the way this is working is we've got a component, which is a helper class, where we're calling a method getImageResource via link. And this component,
you just do Command B to open to navigate to that method if you want to and stay in mode.
So here's our component class application controller helper, and you can see here where we've annotated this with Hystrix command, and we've got a fallback method, get fallback image resource. And in this case, we're creating a resource item and statically populating it with some stuff. We've got a default image URL up here, and that's actually a Spring environment variable that's being pulled in by external configuration. And changing subjects just briefly right there, but we've got external configuration right now enabled to a to a GitHub repository right now. And there's a URL and a YAML file in that repository that Spring Cloud is pulling in and using those values. So this Hystrix command, if something happens or fails within this get image resource via link, then it's going to use the fallback method that's defined up here. So in this case, it's just going to simply return that resource item. And the reason that the fallback works in this case is because this REST exchange method down here, it's going to throw an exception because it can't reach the backend service. And so this is a somewhat typical scenario that you'd want to use a circuit breaker on. Amazon and Netflix both use this pattern for their homepages, for example. Amazon has a list of recommended items, and a lot of us may not even realize it, but sometimes that service request might fail. And instead of getting items that are specifically tailored to your buying history, you might get more generic items over there. But the page looks like it still works. And the same thing goes for Netflix. You would see a recommended list of TV shows or movies that tailored based on your viewing history. If that fails for whatever reason, you might get a more generic list of recommendations there. And you don't know as a user, you don't recognize that. I mean, maybe it's things that aren't as familiar to you, but nevertheless, the UI looks normal. It doesn't just blow up because it can't reach this backend service. And so that's the same approach that we took here, is if your image, obviously in this case, you've uploaded an image and you're more familiar with your images, so you're not expecting a Spring logo, but at the same time, we've got it supported where the UI doesn't blow up. You don't get a 500 page because there's something not running in the background. Okay. And I mentioned external configuration. If I go look at this repository, Springogram config. We've got Springogram hashtag and fallback image URL. I have this enabled on the deployed version of Cloud Foundry, but because I mentioned it, I wanted to go ahead and show it to you. These environment variables, these properties are getting pulled into your application via Spring Cloud config. Okay. Find the slides. Yeah, before I move on, just wanted to show you, we've got, these things are all broken down into these separate projects now. We've got a Springogram backend, we've got a Eureka server, which is the standalone Spring Cloud OSS Eureka server. We've got front end, we've got a standalone Hystrix dashboard that gets wired in, and then we've got two different file services we support, and we can enable or disable them based on Spring profiles. One is the MongoDB file service, and one is the Springogram S3 file service. And we've been showing you the MongoDB one, yeah, if we have time, we'll switch over to the S3 one and take a look at that.
Is this where I start going, can we go to production? Can we go to production like Josh did?
That's right. It's magic.
How does that work?
So this brings me to the next component that we've taken advantage of, and that's Spring Cloud Services. Scott Fredericks talked about this yesterday in the keynote. We've enabled a lot of the open source Spring Cloud components to be available within Cloud Foundry, and just as simple tiles that you can add on to your existing applications. In the case of Springogram, we're using the circuit breaker, service registry, and config client. So let's take a look at.
In a perfect world, we'd be like, let's do a Maven package job, let's do a CF push job, but when you're demoing at conferences, you don't gamble on things like that. So we have it pre-staged at Pivotal Web Services, aka PDubs.
Yep, that's right. The last time I deployed it, it took several minutes to deploy it, so that's kind of boring presentation time, watching things get pushed out.
That is perfectly cool stuff to go to your CI solution and configure that to push to your PCF system, you know, every time you have a successful merge to master or something like that.
This is also why we waited to do this till the end, because the network's kind of slow. Okay, so right here you can see we've got the Springogram front end deployed as a single application. We've got the back end, and we've got MongoDB file service. And we've also got the S3 deployed as well, but again, you can enable, disable those through Spring profiles. And if we go, this is a shared org within our PWS group. We've created a Springogram service registry. We've also created a Springogram circuit breaker dashboard. And these things are as easy as going to the marketplace. And Scott showed this again in the keynote last night, but you just simply click this and you can add these features to your Cloud Foundry org and utilize them within your application. So I'm going to go back to look at those services real quick. And first one is if we look at the service registry.
Thank you, LastPass.
Yes. I don't know Greg's password. You can see that Springogram is up and running. So this is the service registry dashboard that we've created for the PCF Spring Cloud Services functionality. You can see that Springogram.
Is that zoom? Can you zoom that a little bit, maybe?
Yeah, it's not zooming super well. Springogram is up and running. The backend is running. The MongoDB is running. These are all registered within Eureka, and these are the Eureka IDs. And there's some other information down here too, metadata about the services that are running. If we could increase the instances on the backend, for example, very simply going into that application and bumping it up, and then Eureka is going to show, once the application is started, it's going to show a 2 there, or whatever the number of instances that we have running.
And this is where if you invest in like these 12-factor style processes, then it pays off. Like the MongoDB MongoDB portion delegates to a MongoDB instance that we have bound to it. So you can spin up 10 copies of that service and they're all talking to a shared instance of MongoDB. So I don't have to lift a finger once I get to cloud to go to scale.
Yep, that's exactly right. So if I go back up here and we take a look at the Springogram application.
Should see our snapshot from earlier at the bottom.
Yep, there it is. So this is running on Cloud Foundry now, and we've got the history dashboard running here, and you can see that you're getting some data coming back on that little chart, and we can reload this a couple times. And what these are showing, you can see the image resource via link. That's that method that we've annotated with the Hystrix annotation with the fallback method. These are other ones are ribbon commands, and those are, in this case, what this is showing is that the Zool routes, which we actually haven't looked at yet, are also being reported within Hystrix. So if the Zool routes are failing for whatever reason, then Hystrix will report those within this dashboard as well. Right now we're using Zool to basically redirect requests to an API endpoint from the front end, and it goes and hits the Springogram backend, which is where the Spring Data REST application is running. So you can see that we have more things popping up on that graph. If I come over here to the backend service, and disable that. And now when I reload the application, we can see that the fallback method is kicking in. Actually, I gotta go to permanent link. So we can see right here 100% of the requests are failing right now, and this red dot will get bigger and bigger the more times you make requests. And that's simply showing that the circuit is not working. It's failing for between the front end and the back end. So all of this stuff is, the Hystrix dashboard is part of the open source Spring Cloud library. You can run it locally, but as I've shown you on Spring PWS, Spring Cloud Foundry, you're able to drop it in with Spring Cloud Services as just simply installing a tile into your application. And we've handled all the heavy lifting on that side of things. So if we restart this backend application, it'll take a second.
It may be an invalid URI too. That may be an invalid permalink too.
So waiting on it to restart. Hopefully it will restart. Okay, there it is. Oh, right. So the ID that we had created in that permalink is not valid. That's what Greg was mentioning. So I'm trying to refresh a URL that's actually not valid. Oh, still not coming back up, unfortunately. Now you can see, actually now you can see that this other one is starting to fail over here, that first one on the left. And that's the Zool route. So this screen is trying to hit, there it goes, trying to hit the API. So now that first one is turned back to green. The circuit is working.
And we're in production.
Yes, we're in production. So the one last thing that I wanted to show you was looking at the front end was the Zool routes and the configuration for that. And if you come down here, we've got two different profiles defined. One is for presentation. So we've got two routes, two profiles, two different Zool configurations. Both of these, one is the API, and it's saying send everything that's requested through that API endpoint to the Springogram backend. And this is where the combination of using these services really makes things interesting, because this is the Eureka service ID. So we don't have a hard-coded URL in here. Zool is now asking Eureka how to find the Springogram backend, and it doesn't know specifically what the real URL is because that's not configured. And the same thing applies for the Springogram MongoDB file service. That's the Eureka ID there. Alternatively, you could put a hard-coded URL in here if you didn't want to use Eureka, for example, if you wanted to use Zool without Eureka's support. And then we had an S3 profile down here where we're using S3 instead of the MongoDB. So that was an easy way to switch back and forth between MongoDB and S3. And I think we're about out of time, so let me put the slides back up. For using Spring Cloud services, we do have another parent, POM, that just builds on top of Spring Cloud, makes it very easy to enable an application to run on there. There's some simple dependencies to include. They're self-descriptive. Additional sessions. So I mentioned Rob Winch's 2 sessions. One of them is right after this one, the state of securing RESTful APIs with Spring. And then he's got another one tomorrow morning, hands-on Spring security. So if you're concerned about doing any of that stuff, I highly recommend going to one of those sessions. And cloud native Java with Spring Cloud Services. If the Spring Cloud Services stuff is interesting to you, Craig and Scott are going to spend an entire session going over all of that stuff that I spent the last 15 minutes in much more detail, how to enable that within your applications. And securing microservices with Spring Cloud Security. There's another project that's part of Spring Cloud, and Will is going to go over, he's going to spend a session talking about how to enable more security between your microservices that are deployed to Cloud Foundry, and that's something that we didn't address within Springogram this time. We're just using Spring Security's method level security. So if you want to know more about how to secure the actual communication between those different microservices as they're deployed to Cloud Foundry, I recommend going to that session as well. And we've got a little bit more information. Greg's got all of the code for Springogram is deployed to his GitHub URL. I've got a very basic REST service that's using OAuth, and we have OAuth enabled in the app. That was out of scope for this talk, but if you're interested in having OAuth enabled for a REST service, that's a good example for that. And Spring.io for all the other resources. And that's about it. So, have any other questions? If not, we've reached the end of our time.
All right, thanks for coming.
Thank you guys.